Half the people alive on Earth right now ate rice today. Not bread, not corn, not potatoes, rice. A single grain accounts for roughly 20% of all the calories consumed by the entire human species. And it has been doing that for thousands of years. Wars have been fought over it. Empires have risen because of it. Entire civilizations organized their governments, their religions, and their calendars around the planting and harvesting of this one crop. What nobody knew when those first wild grains were pulled from a Chinese swamp nearly 10,000 years ago was that this unremarkable little seed would go on to shape more human lives than any other food in history. The lower Yangtze River Valley, roughly 9,000 years ago. The marshlands stretched out flat and wet across what is now eastern China, and scattered through the shallow water and mud grew clumps of wild grass with tiny edible seeds. The plant was Oryza rufipogon, a scraggly ancestor of modern rice that most people today would walk right past without a second glance. But the people living along those riverbanks noticed something about it. The seeds could be collected, dried, stored, and eaten months later when other food ran short. That was everything. Archaeologists working at the Shangshan site in Zhejiang province have found some of the oldest evidence of rice cultivation anywhere on the planet. The grains recovered from that site date back approximately 10,000 years, and they show clear signs of human selection. The seeds are slightly larger than their wild cousins. The husks are a little thinner. These are not dramatic differences, but they point to something extraordinary. Farmers were already choosing which plants to keep and which to discard, slowly bending the species towards something more useful. Generation after generation, they were turning a swamp weed into a staple crop. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The process of domestication took centuries. It was not a single discovery by a single genius. It was thousands of unnamed farmers across dozens of generations making the same quiet choice. Keep the bigger seeds, throw out the smaller ones. Plant in the wet soil near the river where the water collects naturally. Watch what grows. Repeat. Over time, the rice plants changed. They grew taller. Their grains became plumper. The husks loosened, making them easier to process. And critically, the seeds stopped shattering off the stalk before harvest. Wild rice drops its seeds the moment they ripen, which is great for the plant's survival but terrible for a farmer trying to collect them. The domesticated version held onto its grains until a human hand came along to strip them free. That single trait, the willingness of the plant to wait for the harvester, was the difference between a wild food and a civilization-building crop. The shift from gathering wild rice to deliberately planting it changed everything about how those communities lived. Foragers had to move constantly, following the food. But farmers who planted rice could stay in one place. Permanent villages appeared along the Yangtze and its tributaries. First as clusters of simple wooden houses near the paddy fields, then as larger settlements with communal storage buildings and dedicated workspace for processing grain. Populations grew because a reliable grain supply meant more children survived to adulthood. Storage pits filled with dried rice meant a family could endure a bad season without starving. And the communities that mastered rice cultivation gained an edge over those that hadn't. They were better fed, more numerous, and more organized. In the competition for land and resources along those ancient river valleys, the rice farmers won. But growing rice in quantity required something that no other grain demanded in quite the same way. It required water management on a massive scale. Wild rice grew in marshes and flooded plains, and the domesticated version still needed standing water during its growing season. So the farmers of ancient China did something that would define their civilization for the next several millennia. They started building paddy fields. They dug channels and levees to control the flow of rivers and rainfall, flooding their fields on purpose and draining them at harvest time. The engineering involved was staggering for its era. Entire landscapes were reshaped by hand, with stone tools and raw labor, to create the controlled aquatic environment that rice needs to thrive. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because once those paddy systems were in place, they did more than just grow food. They created surplus. and surplus changed the math of civilization entirely. A village that grows just enough rice to feed itself is a village. A village that grows twice what it needs becomes something else. That extra grain can be stored, traded, or taxed. And it was the taxing part that mattered most to the rulers who emerged across ancient China. Rice became the foundation of imperial finance. Dynasties from the Shang onward built their governments on a simple principle. The state controlled the water controlled the rice, and the rice controlled the people. Farmers paid their taxes in grain. Soldiers ate grain rations. The massive construction projects that defined ancient China, from canals to walls to palaces, were all fed by rice. Without the calories that paddies produced, none of it would have been possible. I mean, think about that for a second. A single crop was funding armies, bureaucracies, and construction projects thousands of years before modern economics even existed. The ancient Chinese didn't call it a commodity or a gross domestic product. They just knew that whoever controlled the rice fields controlled everything. The connection between rice and political power became even more explicit during the Han Dynasty. Around 2,000 years ago, the government maintained enormous state granaries filled with rice reserves, and officials used those reserves to stabilize prices and prevent famine. When rice was plentiful, the state bought surplus grain from farmers to keep prices from collapsing. When harvests failed, the state released grain from its reserves to prevent starvation and, more importantly, to prevent the kind of popular uprisings that toppled dynasties. It was one of the earliest examples of a managed food economy in human history, and rice was the commodity that made it work. Centuries later, the construction of the Grand Canal, that massive waterway connecting northern and southern China, was driven in large part by the need to transport rice from the fertile southern provinces to the political and military centers in the north. The canal stretched over 1,000 miles and took generations to complete. Its primary cargo was rice. By around 5,000 years ago, rice cultivation had spread south into what is now Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar. The warm, wet climates of Southeast Asia were perfect for paddy farming, and the crop took hold rapidly. Farmers in the Mekong Delta and across the Indonesian archipelago adapted Chinese techniques to their own landscapes, building elaborate systems of terraces and irrigation channels that still function today. In some regions, farmers developed 2 and even 3 rice harvests per year, rotating planting cycles to take advantage of the long growing seasons and monsoon rains that drenched the lowlands. The productivity of these double and triple cropping systems was extraordinary, and it supported some of the densest rural populations anywhere on Earth. The journey into India followed the river valleys. Rice reached the Ganges basin and the fertile plains of the subcontinent roughly 4,000 years ago, and it transformed those regions the same way it had transformed China. Population centers formed around productive rice lands. Kingdoms rose, trade networks expanded, carrying surplus grain from one region to another, and with the grain came the cultural identity of rice itself. In Japan, rice arrived around 3,000 years ago, carried by migrants from the Korean peninsula and mainland Asia. The introduction of wet rice farming during the Yayoi period fundamentally restructured Japanese society. Before rice, the people of the Japanese islands were primarily hunters and gatherers. After rice, they became farmers, and the hierarchies that grew out of land ownership and rice production would shape Japan for thousands of years. The word for cooked rice in Japanese, gohan, is also the word for meal. That tells you everything about how deeply the grain embedded itself into the culture. In feudal Japan, rice wasn't just food, it was money. The wealth of a samurai lord was measured not in gold coins, but in koku, a unit of rice roughly equal to the amount needed to feed one person for a year. A domain worth 100,000 koku was a domain that could sustain 100,000 people, or more precisely, a domain that could raise and equip a proportional number of samurai warriors. Land disputes were rice disputes. Taxation was rice taxation. The entire feudal economy revolved around the annual harvest, and a bad rice year could destabilize an entire region. Korea followed a similar pattern. Rice paddies spread across the southern Korean peninsula by about 3,000 years ago, and the grain became central to Korean agriculture, cuisine, and social organization. Korean farmers developed their own sophisticated irrigation techniques, building stone-lined channels and shared reservoir systems that allowed communities to cultivate hillside paddies that would otherwise have been too dry for rice. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about why rice wasn't just food. In many Asian cultures, rice became sacred. Offerings of rice were placed at temples and shrines across China, Japan, Thailand, and Bali. Rice wine was brewed for religious ceremonies. In parts of Indonesia, the rice goddess Dewi Sri was worshipped as a divine provider of life. Farmers believed that rice had a soul, and they treated the harvest with the kind of reverence that Western cultures reserved for bread and wine. The grain wasn't simply eaten, it was honored, and the landscapes that rice cultivation created were themselves astonishing. In the Cordillera Mountains of the northern Philippines, the Ifugao people carved thousands of terraced paddies into steep mountain slopes, stacking them from valley floor to ridgeline like giant green staircases. These rice terraces, some of them over 2,000 years old, are considered among the greatest feats of agricultural engineering in the ancient world. The same kind of terracing appeared in Bali, in Yunnan province in southwestern China, and across the highlands of Vietnam. Each of these terrace systems required generations of labor to build and maintain. Entire communities organized their social structures around the shared work of managing water flow from one paddy level to the next. For a while, things actually seemed stable. Rice fed Asia, Asia fed on rice. The relationship was ancient and seemingly permanent. That didn't last. The arrival of European traders and colonists in Asia during the 1500s changed the trajectory of rice forever. Portuguese merchants were among the first Europeans to encounter large-scale rice agriculture, and they quickly recognized the grain's value as a trade commodity. The Dutch followed, establishing colonial control over the spice islands of Indonesia, where rice paddies stretched across Java and Sumatra. The British would eventually dominate rice production in Burma and India, using colonial infrastructure to export massive quantities of grain for profit. But the most brutal chapter in the global rice story played out not in Asia, but in the American South. When English colonists arrived in the Carolina Lowcountry in the late 1600s, they found a landscape of coastal marshes and tidal rivers that bore a striking resemblance to the rice-growing regions of West Africa. And it was West African expertise that made Carolina rice possible. Enslaved people brought to the colony from the rice-growing regions of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast carried with them generations of knowledge about how to cultivate rice in flooded fields. They knew how to build the levees, how to manage the tidal flow, how to thresh and winnow the harvested grain. The planters who claimed ownership of these people and their labor built vast fortunes on that knowledge. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Or rather, nobody with power did. By the early 1700s, rice had become the most profitable export crop in colonial South Carolina, surpassing even indigo and cotton in some years. Charleston became one of the wealthiest cities in colonial America, and that wealth was built directly on the backs of enslaved Africans working in waist-deep water under a brutal sun. The mortality rate on Carolina rice plantations was staggering. Malaria, exhaustion, and the relentless physical demands of paddy work killed enslaved laborers at rates that exceeded even the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South. The rice that made planters rich was grown in conditions that were, by any measure, among the worst in the entire system of American slavery. This wasn't just about the American South either. European colonial powers had reshaped the global rice trade to serve their own economies. The British exported enormous quantities of rice from colonial Burma and Bengal, sometimes continuing exports even during local famines. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed an estimated 10 million people, unfolded in a region that was actively exporting rice to feed British markets. The grain that was supposed to sustain local populations was being shipped overseas for profit. Rice, the crop that had fed civilizations for millennia, was now being weaponized by colonial economics. The pattern repeated across the colonial world. In French Indochina, colonial administrators reorganized Vietnamese agriculture to maximize rice exports, converting subsistence farms into commercial plantations. In the Dutch East Indies, the cultivation system imposed on Javanese farmers forced them to dedicate a portion of their land and labor to export crops, including rice, for Dutch profit. The colonial rice trade was not a partnership, it was extraction, and the people who grew the rice were rarely the ones who benefited from selling it. The same grain that built empires was now being used to destroy communities. But the relationship between rice and human survival was about to enter yet another chapter, and this one would involve something the ancient farmers of the Yangtze could never have imagined: modern science. By the middle of the 20th century, the world was facing a crisis. Global population was surging, and food production was not keeping pace. Experts warned of mass famines across Asia and Africa. The math was terrifying. More people were being born every year than the existing farmland could feed. And rice yields in most of Asia had barely changed in centuries. Farmers were still using many of the same techniques their ancestors had used 1,000 years earlier, and the harvests they produced were simply not enough. The response came from an unlikely place. In 1960, the International Rice Research Institute, known as IRRI, was founded in Los Banos in the Philippines. Its mission was simple and enormous: find a way to make rice produce more grain per plant, more reliably, on the same amount of land. The institute brought together plant scientists, geneticists, and agricultural engineers from around the world, and they got to work crossing thousands of rice varieties in search of a breakthrough. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. In 1966, IRRI released a variety called IR8. It was a short, stocky plant that looked nothing like the tall, elegant rice varieties Asian farmers had grown for centuries. Traditional rice plants grew tall and spindly. When you added fertilizer to them, they grew even taller, became top-heavy, and fell over, destroying the harvest. IR8 was different. It stayed short, devoted its energy to producing grain rather than stalk, and responded to fertilizer by producing dramatically more rice per acre. Yields doubled. In some fields, they tripled. Farmers who had struggled to feed their families suddenly had surplus grain to sell at market. IR8 was nicknamed Miracle Rice, and the name was not an exaggeration. Across the Philippines, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, the new variety spread with extraordinary speed. Governments distributed seeds. International aid organizations funded irrigation projects. The results were dramatic. India went from the brink of famine in the mid-1960s to self-sufficiency in rice production within about a decade. The country that experts had written off as a hopeless case was suddenly feeding itself. But the adoption of IR8 wasn't seamless. Many farmers resisted the new variety at first, and for good reason. IR8 rice didn't taste as good as their traditional varieties. The texture was different. The aroma was off. Farmers who had spent their lives growing aromatic, long-grain varieties were being told to switch to a stubby, bland plant that they wouldn't want to eat themselves. In some regions, IR8 was referred to dismissively as ugly rice. The taste complaints were real enough that IRRI spent years breeding improved versions that combined the high yields of IR8 with better flavor and cooking qualities. By the early 1970s, newer varieties like IR20 and IR36 began to address those problems, and adoption accelerated further. The broader effort behind IR8 and similar crop improvements became known as the Green Revolution. The agricultural scientist Norman Borlaug, who had done parallel work on wheat varieties, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his role in the movement. The Green Revolution is credited with saving over 1 billion lives, and rice was at the center of it. The grain that had fed civilizations for millennia was now being re-engineered by science to feed a world that was growing faster than anyone had predicted. But the Green Revolution wasn't a fairy tale. The high-yield varieties required more water, more fertilizer, and more pesticides than traditional rice. Farmers who couldn't afford those inputs fell behind. Wealthier farmers bought up land from poorer ones. Rural inequality grew across much of Asia. The environmental costs were real too. Fertilizer runoff poisoned waterways, pesticide use killed beneficial insects. And the monoculture approach, planting one single variety across millions of acres, made entire regions vulnerable to disease outbreaks that could wipe out a harvest overnight. And no, I'm not making that up. In 1970, a disease called grassy stunt virus devastated rice fields across tropical Asia. Because so many farmers were growing the same variety, the virus spread like wildfire. IRI had to scramble to breed resistant strains, and they only succeeded because they had preserved thousands of traditional rice varieties in their seed bank. The old varieties that farmers had abandoned in favor of IR8 turned out to contain the genetic resistance that saved the new ones. It was a close call, and it revealed a tension at the heart of modern agriculture. The push for higher yields was erasing the genetic diversity that rice had accumulated over thousands of years of natural selection and human cultivation. Today, rice remains the most important food crop on Earth for sheer human dependence. Over 3.5 billion people eat rice as a staple food every single day. China and India are the largest producers, together growing more than half the world's supply. Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar round out the top producers, and the combined rice output of Asia accounts for roughly 90% of global production. The scale is staggering. The world produces over 500 million metric tons of milled rice every year, and almost all of it is consumed as food. Unlike corn and wheat, which are heavily diverted into animal feed and industrial products, rice goes overwhelmingly into human mouths, and the grain itself has become wildly diverse. There are over 40,000 known varieties of cultivated rice worldwide, ranging from the sticky, glutinous rice used in Thai desserts and Japanese mochi to the long, slender basmati rice, prized in Indian and Pakistani cuisine, to the short, starchy arborio rice that gives Italian risotto its creamy texture. Jasmine rice from Thailand has a floral fragrance. Black rice, once reserved exclusively for Chinese emperors, is now sold in supermarkets around the world. Red rice varieties grow in the hills of Bhutan and Madagascar. Each variety reflects centuries of local selection by farmers who were breeding for taste, texture, cooking properties, and growing conditions specific to their region. The diversity of rice is a record of human cultural diversity itself. But this dependence comes with costs that are only now being fully understood. Rice paddies are one of the largest human-caused sources of methane, a greenhouse gas that is roughly 80 times more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. The flooded conditions in paddy fields create an oxygen-free environment where bacteria break down organic matter and release methane into the atmosphere. Estimates suggest that rice cultivation accounts for roughly 1.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. That might sound small, but in absolute terms it is enormous, roughly equivalent to the annual emissions of a major industrialized country. Water is the other problem. Rice is the thirstiest major crop on Earth. Growing a single kilogram of rice requires between 3,000 and 5,000 liters of water, depending on the region and farming method. In parts of India and China, groundwater levels are dropping fast as farmers pump water from deeper and deeper wells to flood their paddies. Rivers that once fed rice-growing regions are being drained dry by upstream dams and industrial use. The Mekong River, which supports rice farming for tens of millions of people across Southeast Asia, is under increasing pressure from hydroelectric projects in China and Laos. Climate change is amplifying every one of these problems. Rising temperatures reduce rice yields because the plants suffer during extreme heat, especially at night. Warmer nighttime temperatures force the rice plant to burn more energy through respiration, leaving less energy for grain production. Sea level rise threatens the low-lying coastal deltas where much of the world's rice is grown, including the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, the Irrawaddy Delta in Myanmar, and the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta in Bangladesh. Saltwater intrusion into these regions is already damaging rice paddies that have been productive for centuries. scientists are working on solutions. Drought-resistant rice varieties have been developed for parts of Africa and South Asia, where rainfall is unreliable. Flood-tolerant varieties, bred using genes from traditional rice landraces, can survive being submerged for up to 2 weeks, a trait that is increasingly valuable as extreme weather events become more frequent. Golden rice, a genetically modified variety engineered to produce beta-carotene, has been developed to combat vitamin A deficiency, which causes blindness and death in hundreds of thousands of children each year, primarily in rice-dependent regions. Africa is an especially important frontier for rice. The continent has its own native rice species, Oryza glaberrima, which was independently domesticated in the inland delta of the Niger River in West Africa roughly 3,000 years ago. African rice is tougher and more resilient than its Asian cousin, thriving in harsh soils and inconsistent rainfall, but it produces lower yields. Scientists at the Africa Rice Center have been crossing African and Asian rice to create hybrid varieties called Nerica, short for New Rice for Africa, that combine the hardiness of the African species with the productivity of the Asian one. These hybrids are already being grown across West and East Africa, and they represent one of the most promising paths toward reducing the continent's dependence on imported grain. Meanwhile, the Global Rice Seed Bank at IRRI in the Philippines holds over 130,000 rice varieties from around the world, preserved in climate-controlled vaults. This collection is arguably one of the most valuable genetic archives on the planet, because every one of those varieties contains genes that could prove critical in breeding the rice of the future. Varieties that can handle hotter temperatures, saltier water, or diseases that don't even exist yet. There are also efforts to reduce the environmental footprint of rice farming itself. A technique called alternate wetting and drying involves periodically draining paddy fields during the growing season instead of keeping them continuously flooded. This reduces methane emissions by up to 50% and cuts water use by about 30% without significantly reducing yields. It is being adopted in parts of Vietnam, the Philippines, and Bangladesh, though it requires careful water management that not all farmers have the resources to implement. The story of rice is not really the story of a plant. It is the story of human civilization itself. From the muddy banks of the Yangtze to the terraced hillsides of Bali to the flooded plantations of colonial Carolina to the laboratories of the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, this one grain has been there at every turning point. It fed the armies that built the Great Wall of China. It sustained the traders who navigated the monsoon seas of the Indian Ocean. It enriched the colonial powers who exploited it and devastated the enslaved people who grew it. It saved 1 billion lives during the Green Revolution, and now it sits at the center of one of the defining challenges of our time: feeding a growing planet without destroying the climate and water systems that make farming possible in the first place. Every grain of rice on your plate carries 9,000 years of human ambition, ingenuity, suffering, and survival inside it. We just rarely stop to think about that. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe and drop a comment with the food history topic you want explored next. And if this video taught you something new, leave a like so more people can find it.